Why are people disappearing after the zombie outbreak? In the midst of a zombie apocalypse, a more terrifying force begins to hunt both the living and the undead. People are disappearing without a trace, leaving survivors haunted by fear, paranoia, and the ominous presence of something much darker lurking in the shadows. Story. It wasn't just the zombie outbreak that terrified people. As the days passed and the dead began to roam the earth, a new nightmare unfolded. Survivors were disappearing. At first, it seemed like ordinary chaos, lost in the night, overwhelmed by zombies, perhaps even taken by rival groups. But then, there were no bodies, no blood, no screams. Whispers began spreading among the few remaining groups of survivors, hidden away in the ruins of the old world. They spoke of entire camps vanishing overnight, tents left undisturbed, food still cooking on fires, belongings left scattered as though the people had simply walked off into nothingness. It was something far worse than the dead. Something no one could explain. Ethan was part of a small group who had barricaded themselves inside a large abandoned hospital on the outskirts of town. They had survived the worst of the outbreak, navigating past the mindless hordes of zombies. But now, as night fell, something else began stalking them. It started with strange noises, scratches on the walls, soft whispers in the wind, and footsteps where no one stood. They were scared, but in a world of zombies, you don't always trust your mind to behave rationally. One night, after barricading themselves in the top floor of the hospital, Ethan and his group settled in for sleep. The air was thick with unease. The walls creaked as though something alive moved within them. But the most disturbing sound was the scratching, a relentless, persistent sound that echoed down the dark hallways. Everyone heard it, but no one dared speak of it. Then, the first person vanished. Katie had been on watch, her flashlight illuminating the blood-stained walls. Ethan woke to find her gone. Her chair was overturned, the flashlight abandoned, flickering on the cold, cracked floor. There were no signs of struggle, no blood, no tracks. Just nothing. The group panicked, searching the entire hospital. But Katie was gone. That night, as they huddled in fear, they heard something new, Katie's voice echoing through the halls, faint and distant. She called out to them for help, her voice full of desperation and terror, but she was nowhere to be found. As Ethan and the others searched, her voice grew louder, more frantic. But it wasn't coming from outside, it was coming from within the walls. Ethan knew something was wrong. Something far more dangerous than the zombies had infiltrated their world. The entity, whatever it was toying with them. It thrived on their fear. They began seeing shadows move where there should be none. Figures that looked human but moved too quickly, too silently. Then they saw it, just a glimpse at first, an outline of something tall and gaunt standing in the corner of the room, its eyes glowing with malevolent hunger. One by one, his friends vanished. Sometimes, they would be sitting right next to him, and the next moment, they were simply gone, as if they had been erased from existence. Ethan couldn't understand what was happening. How could they be disappearing without a sound? He thought perhaps the zombies were sneaking in somehow, but there were no signs of struggle, no blood. It was as if the earth itself was swallowing them whole. The survivors dwindled, leaving only Ethan, Luke, and Carla. The hospital had become a tomb, a labyrinth of darkened hallways and haunting whispers. They tried to stay awake, but exhaustion consumed them. Ethan's eyes grew heavy, his mind swimming with the horrors of the past few days. And that's when he saw it again. This time, it was clearer, an entity, tall and twisted, standing at the edge of the room. Its skin was pale and cracked, its body impossibly thin, eyes burning with an unnatural glow. It had no mouth, but Ethan could hear its whispers as if it was speaking directly into his mind. "Join us," it murmured, the voice sending cold shivers down Ethan's spine. He blinked, and in that second, Luke was gone. Carla screamed, but her voice was cut short. Ethan turned, and she was no longer there. He was alone, heart racing. Ethan tried to flee. He stumbled through the dark corridors, the entity always just behind him. The walls seemed to close in, the hospital shifting, twisting into a maze that offered no escape. Every turn he took, every door he opened led him back to the same room, where the entity waited, watching him, taunting him. Ethan tried to fight it, but his body wouldn't obey. His legs grew heavy, his vision blurred. The entity was drawing closer, its hands reaching for him, stretching unnaturally long. Its fingers brushed against his skin, cold as death, and Ethan knew this was the end. But then something strange happened. Time seemed too slow. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. Ethan realized they weren't coming from the entity, they were coming from the walls, from the floor, from everywhere around him. It wasn't just his group that had disappeared. Thousands of voices echoed in the darkness, all of them trapped, just like him. The entity wasn't killing them. It was taking them somewhere else, somewhere far worse than death. Ethan tried to run, but the darkness swallowed him whole. He felt himself falling, deeper and deeper into the void. The last thing he saw was the entity's glowing eyes, watching him with twisted pleasure as he disappeared into nothingness. Ending, Ethan woke up in a place he couldn't describe. It wasn't the hospital anymore, it wasn't anywhere. He was standing in an endless void, surrounded by the whispers of the disappeared. They weren't dead. They were here, trapped in the dark, in the entity's realm, a place between life and death. The coldness seeped into his bones, and he knew that there was no escape. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint sound of scratching again, and the whispers grew louder. Ethan realized, with horrifying clarity, that he had become one of them, a lost soul in the void, waiting for the next victim to join them. The entity continued its hunt, both in the world of the living and beyond, feeding on fear, growing stronger with every disappearance. As the zombie outbreak raged on, more survivors vanished, their voices joining the chorus of the damned. No one ever knew what happened to them. They were simply gone. Part 2. The Dark Entity's Awakening. As the zombie outbreak spiraled out of control, a new terror emerged, one that even the undead seemed to fear. People were no longer just being devoured by the walking corpses, they were vanishing into thin air, their fates unknown. Survivors began noticing something even more chilling, fewer zombies than expected. The dead weren't being killed, they, too, were disappearing. It started in the cities, where entire neighborhoods would go silent overnight. Not a single sound except for the faint hum of an unnatural, chilling energy that filled the air. At first, survivors thought it was the virus mutating, creating something even deadlier. But the truth was far worse. The outbreak had unleashed something beyond this world, an ancient entity that fed not on flesh, but on fear, despair, and the very essence of life itself. This entity, which had been slumbering for centuries, was now fully awake. And its hunger was insatiable. The survivors' camps, once thought to be safe, became hunting grounds for the entity. A group of hardened resistance fighters, including a former soldier named Ben and a scientist named Dr. Rivera, began to notice the pattern. They had fought through hordes of zombies, barely clinging to life, only to realize that something far worse than the undead was stalking them. Dr. Rivera had worked for the government before the fall. She knew more than she had let on, but even she was terrified of what they were dealing with. She had read classified documents, files that spoke of experiments involving dimensional rifts and dark energy. Project Horizon, a failed government project, had been buried, its existence denied. But now, it was clear that the outbreak had triggered something far more dangerous. One night, after several of their group vanished without a trace, Rivera shared her findings with Ben. The look in her eyes was one of pure terror. "This isn't just an infection," she whispered. "We've unleashed something ancient. Something we can't stop." The entity's presence grew stronger each night. Its whispers filled the air, so faint at first that they could be mistaken for the wind. But soon, they became louder, dark, unintelligible murmurs that sent shivers down the spines of anyone who heard them. The survivors who tried to run from it never made it far. They would simply vanish, as though swallowed by the very shadows they sought to escape. No blood, no screams, just an eerie silence in their wake. The few who witnessed these disappearances spoke of a dark figure, its form ever shifting, barely visible in the corner of their eyes. And once it appeared, it was already too late. Ben and Rivera's group knew they had to do something before they all succumbed to the entity. They couldn't fight it with guns or knives. It wasn't something they could kill, this was a force of pure darkness, something that didn't belong in their world. But perhaps there was a way to trap it, to seal it back in whatever hell it had crawled out from. As the days passed, Rivera's research led her to a small town, abandoned since the outbreak began. Beneath the town was an old government facility, one that had been used for the original Project Horizon experiments. It was a long shot, but if there was any place that held answers, it would be there. The journey to the town was fraught with danger. Zombies roamed the roads, but they weren't the biggest threat. Each night, the entity came closer, its whispers growing louder, its presence suffocating. One night, as they camped in the woods, Ben saw a figure standing just outside the circle of light cast by their fire. It didn't move, didn't speak. It simply watched. "We're running out of time," Rivera said, her voice trembling. "It's toying with us." When they finally reached the facility, it was eerily quiet. The town itself was deserted, as if everyone had simply vanished overnight. Inside the facility, the power was long gone, but Rivera managed to find the file she needed. They spoke of interdimensional rifts, of experiments to harness dark energy from beyond our world. But there was one thing that caught her eye, a fail-safe. If the rift could be closed, it would trap anything that had crossed over back in its own dimension. The problem: the device to close the rift required a direct encounter with the entity. As they descended deeper into the facility, the whispers grew louder, almost deafening. The entity knew they were close to stopping it, and it wasn't going to let them succeed without a fight. In the final chamber, where the rift had originally been opened, they found it, a swirling mass of darkness pulsing with an unnatural energy. And standing before it was the entity, its true form finally revealed, a towering, shadowy figure with eyes that glowed like embers, its body shifting and flickering as though it existed in multiple dimensions at once. Ben raised his weapon, but Rivera stopped him. "It's useless," she said. "We can't kill it, but we can trap it." With trembling hands, she activated the fail-safe. The ground shook as the rift began to collapse in on itself. The entity roared, a sound so unnatural that it felt like the world itself was screaming. It lunged at them, its tendrils of shadow reaching for Ben and Rivera. For a moment, it seemed like they were doomed. The entity's cold grip closed around Ben, pulling him toward the darkness. But just as it seemed like all hope was lost, the rift collapsed completely, pulling the entity back with it. There was a blinding flash of light, and then silence. Ben and Rivera stood in the empty chamber, the air heavy with the aftermath of the entity's defeat. They had done it, the rift was sealed, and the entity was gone. But the cost had been high, so many lives lost, so many souls consumed by the darkness. As they emerged from the facility, the sun was rising over the horizon, casting a golden light over the desolate town. The world was still overrun by the undead, and their fight for survival was far from over. But for the first time in what felt like an eternity, there was a glimmer of hope. The nightmare wasn't over, but they had survived the worst of it, or so they thought. In the distance, beyond the mountains, the faint sound of whispers could still be heard, carried on the wind, a reminder that the darkness was never truly gone. It was only waiting.